In this video, I'm going to share my top 5 mixing mistakes. And there are already a few videos out there on this topic, so this is kind of my take on it, and I'm going to do it slightly differently. Instead, these are the biggest mistakes that I've made in the past. And overcoming each of these things led to a kind of aha moment for me, a breakthrough in the quality of my mixes, because these are bigger picture mixing mistakes. We're going to be looking at the mixing process in general, and also the learning process too. So let's dive right into those top 5 mixing mistakes. But first, be sure to download our free mixing workflow cheat sheet that's going to take you through the entire mixing process and give you a step-by-step framework to follow. It's completely free. Head to the link in the description or on screen now. So now let's dive into those top 5 mixing mistakes. Hey, Rob here from Musician on a Mission. Let's dive right in with mistake number 1, which is mixing from the ground up. Now, this isn't objectively a mistake. If you mix in this way, I'm not saying you're mixing wrong. However, for me personally, for a long time, I used to mix from the ground up. And what I mean by that is starting with the bass or the kick drum in solo and then bringing things in one by one. Now, this works okay, but as soon as I started a mix with a kind of top-down approach, a lot of people call it, where I started with the faders all up and then started with mix bus processing and then group processing, kind of worked down into the details and ended with things like the kick drum and the bass, that made a huge impact. And for me personally, mixing from the ground up for so long was a mistake. I wish I'd tried a different approach much sooner. So let me show you what I actually mean by this. Here I have a project where all I've done is imported the files and I've done a bit of organization. Now, if I was following the old approach, the kind of ground up approach, I might bring all the faders down and then just bring in the bass. I would mix the bass, I'd add EQ to it, I'd make it sound really good in solo, and then I might bring in the kick. I'd balance that in, and then I'd also EQ, compress the kick, and do anything else I want to do there, etc. But then it gets to the point where I bring things in one by one, I'm adding EQ, and then suddenly by the time I've got all of my channels in, I realize actually I EQ'd the bass completely wrong. I don't want it to sit there in the mix. It's now clashing with the guitar, and I have to go back and change my EQ on the bass. And equally with the kick drum, I'm like, well, now I actually want the kick drum to have more low, so I have to go back and revisit that. And if you start with those small details like the EQ on the kick and the bass, personally, I always find that I end up going back and changing it once I've got the rest of the mix in for context. And that's the real reason here why I much prefer a top-down approach, which would be starting with, again, no plugins or anything like that. I would still balance my channels one by one. So I might bring in the vocal, but then do no EQ compression, literally then just balance everything else in, kind of in order of importance until I end up with a rough volume balance. And then I've got the whole mix in. So I've got the context for decisions. If I then EQ the snare, I already kind of know where the snare's sitting in the mix. If I EQ the kick drum, again, I know. But I wouldn't even start with that. I'd now start with the mix bus. And if the whole mix is sounding muddy, I might cut a bit, I might add some top end, stuff like that. Then I'll add mix bus compression. And then I might even move on to my group buses. I might EQ the drum kit as a whole before I get to the specifics of the kick and the snare. So this was a breakthrough for me. As soon as I started mixing in this way, it made a huge difference. Of course, it does depend on the genre as well. I work with quite a lot of rock music where you have a full band and it makes sense to work in this way, where you're treating it all kind of as one thing. Whereas if you work with electronic music or mainstream music, maybe you do just want to start with the vocal and mix that really well in isolation and then bring things in one by one. These are all valid approaches. Just for me personally, this made a big difference, and I at least recommend you give it a try. Again, I go through this in that mixing workflow cheat sheet that I mentioned before. I actually take you through step by step the slow focus mixing process, which is what I call this, where you start with the big picture and then work down to the smaller details, slowly focus in on those individual elements. Mistake number 2 was mixing without references. I must have mixed without references for about 5 years. I don't even know where I came across the idea of using references. I feel like a lot of people talk about it now, so if you've seen any of my videos or a lot of videos on YouTube, you're probably aware of references already, but I just want to drill in that references are really, really helpful, especially when you're starting out. I don't use them as much now, but I went through a period of a few years where I was really, really reliant on references when I discovered them for the first time. And if you've never been through that process, then I highly recommend you do it. You don't have to use a special plugin. There are plugins that will help you use references. Magic AB is one of them. I don't think it's even on sale anymore. There's plenty out there, but you don't have to use one of those. Instead, you can just import a reference into your DAW, add it over here somewhere, and add markers so you can skip to it. If you do that, just make sure you set up a virtual mix bus so that you're not adding EQ to your stereo out and then also EQing the reference. We want the reference clean, so we'd have to create this kind of virtual mix bus where we then add all of our mix bus processing so that we're only adding EQ, compression, etc. to our mix and not the reference track. So that's the only caveat there. I'm going to link to different videos in the description for each of these mistakes that will go into a bit more detail. So if you want to learn a bit more about using references, go and check the description for that video. Mistake number 3 was that I spent a lot of time learning advanced techniques and tricks like parallel processing, whether that's compression, EQ, saturation, stuff like that, multi-band compression, and dynamic EQ, stuff like that. Now, these tools are great and they are really, really helpful in certain situations, but they're the tools that get you the last kind of 5%. Being good at mixing is 95% volume balancing, EQ, compression, reverb, not much else. But in the early days, I spent so much time learning multiband compression. I used to just add multiband compression to my whole mix bus and then completely ruin the mix. I'd have quite a good mix going. I'd do crazy stuff like this where I then compress the lows and compress the highs because it sounded quite good at the time. But in reality, it just made my mix so much worse and it just really kind of squashed them and made them sound weird. Multiband compression is a really powerful tool, so you want to be careful with it, but it can have its applications when you get to that last 5% and your mixes already sound awesome and you're looking for those small improvements. But until that point, don't bother spending time learning these advanced tips and tricks. There are a whole bunch of mixers, really good professional mixers, who don't even use multiband compression or parallel processing or stuff like that. You can get away with just having a kind of simple approach. So you want to learn that kind of basic stuff first and get really good at it before you move on to the advanced stuff, if ever, because you'll progress much, much faster that way. Mistake number 4 is that I didn't use saturation sooner. And this could seem like it contradicts with the point that I just made. And to be honest, the reason I didn't use saturation is because after I kind of had a bad experience with multiband compression and then spoke to different engineers and realized, hey, I don't actually need to know this tool now, at least, I lumped saturation into that category as well of advanced tools that I can learn later on. But in retrospect, saturation is actually quite simple and easy to use. I actually just released a video on saturation and I'll link to that in the description again. It's actually worth learning quite early on because it can make a big difference when you have really dull, boring channels that you want to add interest to. In general though, just it's another way to shape tone that's not reliant on EQ. And shaping tone is kind of one of the main things that we're doing when we're mixing. Usually we just use EQ for that, but there's certain things that EQ can't do that we need saturation for. So that's why I think it's an integral tool and I wish I'd started using it sooner. So again, if you're kind of following this approach of, well, I'm just going to really focus on the basics, as soon as you move beyond compression, EQ, reverb and delay, that kind of stuff, I think the first tool you should learn next is saturation. And then finally, mistake number 5, and you're probably going to see a bit of a theme here, is that thinking that mixing was more complex than it is. I used to think that there were kind of silver bullets, things that people were doing that I didn't know about, secrets to the mixing process. But let me tell you, there really aren't any secrets. 80% of the mix comes from the volume balance, panning, compression, EQ, reverb, basically. Maybe delay and then kind of saturation, less impact. But really it's those core things. It's actually quite boring. And that's why I think we're always looking for a silver bullet. We're always looking for what's that thing that my mixes are missing. I feel like I'm doing everything right, but they still don't sound professional, so I must be missing something. But in reality, you're not. You just need to keep going, doing what you're already doing, and gradually over time, you will improve with those basic tools. And one story that comes to mind, actually, when I was at university, which was crap, I didn't learn anything at all. It was basically a complete waste of money. Besides this one drum workshop where they brought in an outside lecturer, his name was John Gallen. He's a really well-known British engineer, and he came in to show us how to record drums and get a professional sound, and then also he opened up one of his recent mixes to show us. And I was waiting to learn all these cool tricks and tips and find out what that missing element was from my mixes, but in reality we spent about 2 hours tuning a snare drum, playing with the dampening and slightly moving around a microphone. It was boring, to be completely honest. It was really boring. And that's when I realized the importance of really spending a lot of time getting it right at the source. But then he opened up a recent mix and it was a huge project with like 60 different channels. It was a classical piece with some modern elements. And at that point I was like, okay, great. We've done the snare. Now we can actually move on to some fun stuff, mixing. He opened up his mix and honestly, there are about 20 plugins across the whole thing. And they were basically all EQ and compression. And then maybe like 1 or 2 reverb plugins. It was crazy. And from that day onwards, I realized there is no secret. It is literally just these boring things that people overlook because sometimes they're not fun. They're not sexy to talk about, but they are the things that really matter. And I wish I'd realized that sooner and stop looking for silver bullets, because as soon as I've really just doubled down on those things and just focused on those things when I was mixing and in terms of my learning as well, that's when I started to really progress faster. So there you go, 5 mixing mistakes. Like I said, I've included resources in the description to learn more about each of those things. And don't forget to download the cheat sheet as well. That'll take you through the whole mixing workflow so that you can kind of go through the mixing process step by step instead of wondering what order to do things or where to start. And that'll go a bit deeper into that slow focus or top down approach. So it's completely free. Head to the link in the description or on screen now to grab that. That's all for this video. I'll see you again soon, and remember, create regardless.